Perhaps you have a coin nearby right now. Maybe it's resting in a pocket or sitting in a dish by the door. If you were to hold it, you'd feel its familiar weight, the worn edges smoothed by countless hands before yours. We rarely pause to consider where such a small, ordinary object came from, and yet, money is one of humanity's oldest inventions, a quiet miracle that connects us to traders in ancient marketplaces and farmers in distant centuries. Tonight, we'll trace the long, winding story of how money came to be. We'll travel back thousands of years, through gift-giving cultures and temple economies, past gleaming coins and crinkled paper, following the thread of human ingenuity across continents and ages. There's no need to concentrate too hard. Let the story wash over you like a gentle stream. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow your mind to drift as we explore the sleepy history of money. You may have heard a story about how money began. It goes something like this. Long ago, before there was currency, people traded directly with one another. A farmer with extra wheat might swap it for a potter's jug. A fisherman might exchange his catch for a basket woven by his neighbour. This system, we're told, was called barter, and while it worked well enough in small communities, it had an obvious problem. What if the potter didn't need wheat? What if the fisherman had no use for baskets? To solve this difficulty, the story continues. People invented money. They chose certain objects to serve as a medium of exchange, something everyone would accept, and commerce became much simpler. It's a sensible story. It appears in economics textbooks around the world, and it probably isn't true. This narrative, often called the barter myth, can be traced back to the 18th century, to the writings of the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith. In his famous work, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, Smith imagined how primitive economies might have functioned. He pictured hunters and farmers trading meat for grain, gradually developing money as a more efficient solution. It was a thought experiment, a reasonable guess based on logic rather than evidence. And for centuries, economists accepted it as fact. But here's the curious thing. When anthropologists began studying traditional societies around the world, societies that had little contact with modern economies, they found something unexpected. They couldn't find evidence of pure barter economies anywhere. Not one. In all the careful research, in all the remote villages and island communities, no society seemed to operate the way Adam Smith had imagined. People weren't walking around trying to swap chickens for haircuts. Instead, anthropologists discovered something more interesting, something warmer and more human. Before money, before even the concept of trade as we know it, there were gifts. Imagine a small community, perhaps 10,000 years ago. Everyone knows everyone else. The families have lived alongside one another for generations. In such a world, if your neighbour's harvest fails, you share your grain with them. You don't haggle over the price. You don't demand immediate repayment. You simply help, because that's what people do. And because you know that someday, when your own luck turns, they'll help you in return. This is what anthropologists call a gift economy. It's not charity exactly, nor is it trade. It's something in between, a web of obligations and relationships that bind a community together. The gift creates a connection. The person who receives it isn't just grateful, they're gently indebted, part of an ongoing relationship of mutual support. The French anthropologist Marcel Mauss spent years studying gift-giving cultures in the early 20th century. His research took him from the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest to the islands of Melanesia. What he found was a world where gifts were never truly free. They always carried an expectation, not of exact repayment, but of reciprocity over time. To give was to create a bond. To receive was to accept an obligation. Consider the potlatch ceremonies of the Pacific Northwest, practiced by peoples such as the Kwakiutl and the Haida. At these elaborate gatherings, hosts would give away enormous quantities of goods, blankets, carved boxes, food, and other treasures. To Western observers this seemed puzzling. Why would anyone give away their wealth? But within the culture, the potlatch made perfect sense. By giving generously, a host gained prestige and honour. The recipients, in turn, were obligated to reciprocate at future ceremonies. Wealth flowed through the community in a great circle, binding everyone together. Half a world away, in the islands of Melanesia, anthropologists documented the Kula Ring. This was a complex system of exchange that connected communities across vast stretches of ocean. Participants would travel by canoe to distant islands, carrying shell ornaments, red necklaces that circulated in one direction around the ring, and white armbands that moved in the opposite direction. These objects weren't money in any practical sense. You couldn't buy food with them. But they carried immense social significance. To possess a famous necklace, one that had passed through the hands of great chiefs, was to hold a piece of history. And the relationships forged through Kula exchange, the partnerships and obligations, were more valuable than any currency. What these examples suggest is that before money, human economies ran on something else entirely: trust, reputation, and the slow accumulation of social debts. In a small community where everyone knows one another, you don't need coins to keep track of who owes what. Memory serves well enough. The farmer knows that he helped the potter during the planting season, and the potter knows that she'll return the favour when she can. These debts aren't written down. They don't bear interest, but they're real nonetheless, woven into the fabric of daily life. The anthropologist David Graeber, in his influential book Debt: The First 5,000 Years, argued that this kind of informal credit was the true foundation of early economies. Long before coins existed, people were keeping careful mental accounts of favours given and received. A hunter might share his kill with the village, knowing that when he grew old or fell ill, the village would take care of him. A skilled craftsperson might provide tools to neighbours, confident that they would reciprocate with food, shelter, or labour. In this sense, debt came before money, not after. The idea of owing something to someone and of eventually settling that debt was already ancient when the first coins were struck. Money didn't create the concept of credit. It merely formalized it. But gift economies and informal credit systems have their limits. They work beautifully in small communities where everyone knows everyone else, where reputation matters and social pressure keeps people honest. But what happens when communities grow larger? What happens when you need to trade with strangers, people you'll never see again, people whose reputation means nothing to you? This is where the problems begin. This is where the old systems start to strain. Economists call this the problem of the double coincidence of wants. In a pure barter system, a successful trade requires that each party has exactly what the other needs, and needs exactly what the other has, at exactly the same time. The farmer with wheat must find a potter who not only has jugs to spare, but also happens to need wheat. The fisherman must locate a weaver who wants fish. The odds of such perfect matches are slim, especially in larger communities with more specialized trades. You can imagine the frustration. A skilled blacksmith needs food for his family, but the farmer has no use for another plough. A healer with valuable herbs wants new sandals, but the cobbler's children are healthy and need no medicine. Without a common medium of exchange, trade becomes a tedious puzzle of mismatched needs. Some anthropologists believe that even in ancient times, people found ways around this problem that didn't involve pure barter. Perhaps the blacksmith helped the farmer anyway, trusting that the farmer would remember the favour. Perhaps the healer gave her herbs to a middleman, a respected elder who kept track of who owed what to whom. These informal systems of credit and intermediation could stretch the gift economy a bit further, allowing trade between people who weren't close friends or relatives. But as populations grew and communities came into contact with distant strangers, something more was needed. The old bonds of trust and obligation couldn't stretch across hundreds of miles. You couldn't rely on reputation when dealing with a merchant from a faraway land, someone you'd never met and would never see again. Slowly, gradually, over many generations, people began to settle on certain objects that could serve as a common measure of value. These weren't quite money as we know it today. They didn't have kings' faces stamped on them, and they weren't minted by governments. But they shared a crucial property. Everyone agreed to accept them. We'll explore these early currencies in the next part of our story, the shells and cattle and precious metals that bridge the gap between gift economies and modern money. But for now, let's pause and appreciate how far we've come from the old textbook story. Money didn't emerge because barter was inconvenient. It emerged from something deeper, from the human need to maintain relationships across time and distance, to keep track of obligations and trust, and to connect with strangers in a world that was growing ever larger. The gift economies of our ancestors may seem distant now. We live in a world of credit cards and bank transfers, of salaries deposited electronically and bills paid with the tap of a phone. But in some ways, the old systems still echo in our lives. We still give gifts to strengthen relationships. We still remember favours and feel obligated to return them. And every time we hand over money, we're participating in a web of trust that stretches back thousands of years, to a time when a gift of grain or a shared meal was the closest thing to currency that anyone had ever known. As communities grew and the old bonds of trust began to stretch thin, people searched for something tangible to hold, something that could carry value from hand to hand, from village to village, across the distances that separated strangers. They found their answers in the most unexpected places, in the curve of a seashell, in the gentle eyes of cattle, in crystals of salt and bricks of pressed tea. These were the world's first currencies, and their variety tells us something beautiful about human ingenuity. Perhaps the most remarkable of these early monies was the cowrie shell. If you've ever walked along a tropical beach, you may have seen them, small glossy shells no bigger than a thumbnail, with a distinctive slit running along one side. The species most commonly used as currency was the Caprea moneta, also known as the money cowrie. These shells are found in the warm waters of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, particularly around the Maldive Islands, and for thousands of years they served as money across vast stretches of the globe. The cowrie shell had qualities that made it almost perfect for use as currency. It was durable, able to survive years of handling without breaking or wearing away. It was portable, light enough to carry in great quantities. It was difficult to counterfeit since each shell was a product of nature. grown slowly in the warm seas, and perhaps most importantly, it was beautiful. The smooth, polished surface of a cowrie shell has an almost hypnotic quality. You can imagine ancient traders running their thumbs across that glossy curve, feeling the satisfying weight of wealth in their hands. Cowrie shells were used as money in China as early as the Song Dynasty, around 1500 years before the Common Era. In fact, the Chinese character for money, which looks something like a small pictograph, is derived from the shape of a cowrie shell. This linguistic connection has survived for more than 3,000 years, a quiet reminder of a time when shells were treasure. But China was only one part of the cowrie's vast domain. These little shells travelled along trade routes across Asia, reaching India, Southeast Asia, and the islands of the Pacific. They crossed the deserts and savannas of Africa, becoming a dominant currency in regions stretching from the Sahara to the southern coasts. In some parts of West Africa, cowrie shells remained in use as money well into the 20th century. That's a remarkable span, thousands of years across multiple continents, for a currency that grew in the ocean and fit in the palm of your hand. The cowrie shell reminds us that money doesn't have to be made of metal. It doesn't have to be stamped with the face of a king or guaranteed by a government. It simply has to be something that people agree to accept, something that carries value because everyone believes it does. Of course, shells were far from the only objects pressed into service as early money. In many cultures, particularly among the herding peoples of Europe, Asia, and Africa, wealth was measured not in shells but in livestock. Cattle, sheep, and goats were the treasures of the ancient world, walking stores of value that could be seen grazing in the fields. Imagine a world where your wealth could wander through the meadow, where your savings had soft brown eyes and needed to be fed each morning. This was the reality for countless generations of our ancestors. A family's cattle were their security, their status, their inheritance. To have many cattle was to be rich. To lose your herd was to face ruin. This deep connection between livestock and wealth has left traces in our language that persist to this day. The English word pecuniary, meaning relating to money, comes from the Latin word pecus, which means cattle. The word capital, which we use to describe wealth or financial assets, may derive from the Latin caput, meaning head, as in a head of cattle. And the word fee, which we use for payments and charges, has ancient roots in words meaning cattle or livestock. When we talk about capital and fees and pecuniary matters, we're unconsciously echoing a time when real, living animals were the measure of prosperity. Cattle had obvious advantages as a store of value. They could reproduce, increasing your wealth over time. They provided milk, leather, and eventually meat. They could pull ploughs and carry burdens. A herd of cattle was not just money sitting idle. It was a productive asset, working for its owner even as it represented their savings. But cattle also had significant drawbacks as currency. They were difficult to divide. If you needed to make a small purchase, you couldn't easily cut a cow in half. They required care and feeding, and they could sicken or die. And perhaps most inconveniently, they couldn't be carried in your pocket. For everyday transactions, for buying bread or paying a craftsman for a simple repair, cattle were simply too cumbersome. Similar limitations applied to other forms of livestock money. Sheep and goats were somewhat easier to manage, but they still presented challenges of divisibility and portability. People needed something more practical for daily commerce, something that could be measured out in precise amounts, stored easily, and transported without difficulty. One solution was grain. In agricultural societies, wheat, barley, and rice served as common measures of value. Grain was essential for survival, which gave it inherent worth. It could be divided into small quantities for minor transactions, or accumulated in great storehouses for major purchases. Temples and palaces in ancient Mesopotamia kept enormous reserves of grain, functioning almost like early banks. Workers and soldiers were often paid in rations of barley, a practice that continued for thousands of years. But grain had its own problems. It could spoil if stored improperly. It was vulnerable to pests and moisture. And while a bag of wheat might be portable enough for a local transaction, carrying enough grain for a major purchase across long distances was impractical. Merchants and traders needed something more durable, more concentrated in value. This is where salt enters our story. Today, salt is so common and inexpensive that we barely think about it. We sprinkle it on our food without a second thought. But for most of human history, salt was precious. It was essential for preserving meat and fish in the ages before refrigeration. It was necessary for human health, for the functioning of our bodies, and in many parts of the world it was difficult to obtain. In regions far from the sea or salt deposits, salt had to be transported over great distances, making it rare and valuable. Blocks of salt were traded along ancient caravan routes across the Sahara Desert. In Ethiopia, salt bars called a mole served as currency for centuries, and in the Roman Empire, soldiers were sometimes paid in salt or given an allowance to purchase it. This payment was called a salarium, from the Latin word for salt, and it gives us our modern word salary. Every time you receive your salary, you're participating in a linguistic tradition that stretches back to Roman legions and their precious allowances of salt. Salt had many of the qualities that make for good money. It was valuable relative to its weight, making it easier to transport than grain. It was reasonably durable if kept dry. It could be divided into smaller portions for everyday purchases, and everyone needed it, which meant everyone would accept it in exchange for goods and services. But salt wasn't the only surprising substance to serve as currency. In the highlands of Tibet and along the ancient Silk Road, money sometimes came in the form of tea. Not loose tea leaves, but compressed bricks of tea, dried and pressed into dense portable blocks. These tea bricks were traded across Central Asia for centuries. Nomadic peoples who had little use for coins found tea bricks far more practical. The tea could be stored for long periods, transported easily on horseback, and when you finally reached your destination or grew thirsty on the journey, you could break off a piece and brew yourself a warming cup. Tea bricks remained in use as currency in parts of Siberia and Mongolia into the 20th century. Russian traders who ventured into Central Asia learned to carry tea bricks alongside their other goods, knowing that the compressed tea would be accepted as payment where silver coins might be refused. Across the ocean, in what would later become the United States and Canada, indigenous peoples developed their own forms of currency. The most famous of these was wampum, beads made from the shells of whelks and quahog clams. These beads were painstakingly carved, drilled and polished, then strung together into belts and strings of varying lengths. White beads came from whelk shells, while purple beads, which were rarer and more valuable, came from the quahog. Wampum was more than just money. It held deep ceremonial and diplomatic significance. Treaties were sealed with gifts of wampum belts. Important agreements were recorded in the patterns woven into the beads. When European colonists arrived, they quickly recognized wampum's value and began using it in trade with indigenous nations. For a time, wampum even circulated as legal currency in some colonial settlements, a remarkable meeting of two very different economic traditions. As we consider this extraordinary diversity of early currencies, from cowrie shells to cattle, from salt to tea bricks to wampum, a pattern begins to emerge. Certain qualities made an object suitable for use as money. The object needed to be durable, able to withstand the wear of countless transactions without falling apart. It needed to be portable, easy enough to carry that trade could flow freely. It needed to be divisible, capable of being broken into smaller units for everyday purchases. It needed to be uniform so that one unit was much like another, making valuation simple. And it needed to be scarce enough to retain value, but not so rare that there wasn't enough to go around. Different objects met these criteria to varying degrees. Cowrie shells were wonderfully durable and portable, but they couldn't be divided without destroying them. Cattle were excellent stores of value that could grow over time, but they were impossible to carry and difficult to divide. Salt was divisible and portable, but it could dissolve in the rain. Each form of early money represented a compromise, a balance of advantages and disadvantages that made sense within a particular culture and environment. What's remarkable is how long some of these currencies endured. Cowrie shells circulated for more than 3,000 years. Cattle remained a measure of wealth in pastoral societies well into modern times. Salt and tea served as money in remote regions until quite recently. These were not primitive systems that disappeared as soon as something better came along. They were sophisticated solutions to real economic problems, solutions that worked well for the communities that used them. And yet, as trade networks expanded and economies grew more complex, the limitations of commodity money became increasingly apparent. Carrying enough cattle to purchase a ship was obviously impractical. Transporting sufficient salt to fund a trading expedition required its own expedition. Merchants dealing with distant lands, exchanging goods across cultural and linguistic boundaries, needed something more compact, more universally recognized, more precisely measurable. They found their answer in metal. In lumps of copper and bars of silver and rings of gold, ancient traders discovered a form of wealth that combined many of the best qualities of earlier currencies. Metal was durable, nearly indestructible compared to grain or tea. It was divisible, capable of being cut into pieces of any size. It was portable, concentrating considerable value into a small, heavy package. And it was beautiful, gleaming with a luster that seemed almost magical. But the age of metal money would bring its own challenges, its own innovations, and eventually its own transformations. For now, let us simply appreciate the ingenuity of our ancestors who looked at shells and cattle and salt and saw in them the possibility of exchange, the foundation of commerce, the quiet beginnings of the world's economy. The gleam of metal has captivated human beings for as long as we have walked the earth. There is something almost magical about the way gold catches the light, the soft luster of silver, the warm glow of copper held up to a fire. Our ancestors felt this pull just as we do today. And gradually, over thousands of years, they discovered that these beautiful, enduring substances could serve a purpose beyond ornament. Metal could become money. The transition from commodity currencies like shells and cattle to metal money was not sudden. It happened slowly across many generations, in different places and at different times. People didn't wake up one morning and decide to abandon their cowrie shells in favour of silver. Instead, metal gradually proved itself superior for certain kinds of transactions, and its use spread organically, flowing along trade routes and seeping into local economies. What made metal so appealing as a form of money? Several qualities set it apart from the currencies that came before. Metal was extraordinarily durable. Unlike grain, it wouldn't rot or attract pests. Unlike cattle, it wouldn't sicken and die. A piece of gold buried in the ground could be dug up centuries later, still gleaming, still valuable. This permanence made metal an ideal store of wealth, something you could set aside for your children and grandchildren, confident that it would retain its worth across the generations. Metal was also highly divisible. If you needed to make a small purchase, you could cut a piece of silver into tiny fragments. If you needed to make a large payment, you could gather those fragments together or use bigger pieces. This flexibility solved one of the great problems of cattle currency. You no longer had to worry about making change when your smallest unit of money was an entire living animal. And metal was portable in a way that most commodity currencies were not. A small pouch of gold could represent the value of an entire herd of cattle, concentrated into something you could carry on your person. For merchants travelling long distances, for traders crossing deserts and seas, this compactness was invaluable. You could carry your fortune with you, hidden in your robes or tucked into your saddlebags. The earliest metal used as money was probably copper. Copper was relatively abundant and easy to work with, soft enough to be shaped without sophisticated tools. Archaeological evidence suggests that copper objects were being exchanged in the ancient Near East as early as 5,000 years before the Common Era. These weren't coins in any recognizable sense, just lumps and pieces of metal that people agreed to accept as valuable. But copper had limitations. It was common enough that accumulating significant wealth required large, heavy quantities. For major transactions, for the kind of trade that built empires, something rarer was needed, something like silver. Silver emerged as a dominant form of money in ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq. By around 3,000 years before the Common Era, the Sumerians had developed a sophisticated economy in which silver served as the primary measure of value. They had a word for a standard unit of silver, the shekel, which represented a weight of roughly 8.3 grams. This wasn't a coin, not yet. It was simply a weight, a way of measuring how much silver was being exchanged. Imagine a merchant in ancient Ur, one of the great cities of Sumer. He has goods to sell, perhaps fine textiles woven by skilled craftspeople. A buyer approaches, interested in purchasing a bolt of cloth. They negotiate a price, settling on a certain number of shekels of silver. But how does the buyer pay? He doesn't hand over stamped coins from a leather purse. Instead, he produces pieces of silver, perhaps rings or small bars or irregular lumps. The merchant takes out his scales, those essential tools of ancient commerce, and carefully weighs the silver to ensure he's receiving the correct amount. This was the reality of metal money. Before the invention of coins, every transaction required weighing. Merchants carried scales with them wherever they went, along with sets of standardized weights. The process was slow and required a certain level of trust. Was the silver pure, or had it been mixed with cheaper metals? Was the merchant scale accurate, or was he cheating his customers? These questions hung over every exchange. The Mesopotamians developed sophisticated techniques for assessing the quality of silver. Skilled assayers could test metal for purity by examining its color, its weight relative to its size, or its behavior when heated. Temples and palaces employed experts whose job was to verify the quality of the silver flowing through the economy. These institutions functioned almost like early banks, storing silver, making loans, and keeping meticulous records of transactions on clay tablets. These clay tablets are one of the treasures of ancient history. Thousands of them have survived, preserved in the dry soil of Mesopotamia, and they give us an extraordinarily detailed picture of economic life in the ancient world. We can read contracts for loans, receipts for purchases, records of wages paid and debts owed. The people of Sumer and Babylon may have lived 4,000 years ago, but their economic concerns were remarkably similar to our own. While silver dominated in Mesopotamia, gold held sway in ancient Egypt. The Egyptians had access to abundant gold deposits, particularly in the region they called Nubia, to the south of Egypt proper. Gold flowed into Egypt in quantities that astonished the ancient world. The pharaohs accumulated vast treasures, filling their tombs with golden artifacts that still dazzle us today. Gold was too valuable for everyday transactions. Ordinary Egyptians used grain and other commodities for their daily needs. But for matters of state, for trade with foreign powers, for the wealth of temples and palaces, gold was supreme. Egyptian gold took many forms before the age of coins. Rings of gold were used as a kind of currency, their value determined by weight. Gold dust was measured out on delicate scales. Bars and ingots were cast in standard sizes for ease of storage and transport. The Egyptians, like the Mesopotamians, faced the challenge of ensuring that their metal money was pure. Gold could be adulterated with silver or copper, stretching a small amount of precious metal into a larger but less valuable mass. Detecting such fraud required expertise and careful testing. The phrase acid test comes from one ancient method of verification, using acid to reveal the true composition of a suspicious piece of metal. Across the ancient Mediterranean, metal circulated in forms that were standardized by weight, but not yet by shape. Archaeologists have found remarkable evidence of this trade in the form of copper ingots shaped like stretched animal hides, with 4 protruding corners that made them easy to carry. These oxide ingots, as they're called, have been discovered in shipwrecks and ancient warehouses from Cyprus to Sardinia. Each ingot weighed roughly 29 kilograms, a substantial unit of value that could be traded whole or cut into pieces as needed. Cyprus was a major source of copper in the ancient world. The island's very name may derive from the word for copper, or perhaps it's the other way around. Either way, Cypriot copper flowed across the Mediterranean in vast quantities, feeding the bronze-making industries of Egypt, Greece, and the Near East. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was the defining metal of an entire age of human history, and its production required extensive trade networks spanning thousands of miles. The metal money of the ancient world took many forms: silver rings threaded onto strings, gold dust in leather pouches, copper ingots stacked in palace storerooms, pieces of metal cut from larger bars, their edges rough and irregular. This last form has a name that captures its nature perfectly: hack silver. It's a wonderfully evocative term suggesting merchants with their knives, cutting pieces of silver to make up the exact weight for a transaction. Hack silver has been found in hoards across the ancient Near East and Mediterranean. These hoards offer glimpses into ancient commerce, collections of metal pieces accumulated by merchants or hidden by families in times of trouble. Sometimes the pieces are relatively uniform, suggesting an attempt at standardization. More often, they are a jumble of shapes and sizes, united only by their material and their function as stores of value. All of this metal money, whether silver or gold or copper, required one essential technology: the scale. Without accurate weighing, metal currency couldn't function. The invention and refinement of balance scales was therefore crucial to the development of money. Ancient scales were beautifully simple devices, a beam balanced on a central pivot, with pans hanging from each end. Metal went into one pan, standardized weights into the other. When the beam hung level, you knew you had the correct amount. The weights themselves were often works of art. Ancient weight sets have been found shaped like animals, like human figures, like geometric forms. They were made from stone, from bronze, from carefully calibrated pieces of metal. Possessing an accurate set of weights was essential for anyone engaged in trade, and of course dishonest merchants might keep multiple sets, one for buying and another for selling, profiting from the difference. Temple economies played a crucial role in maintaining trust in this system. Temples in Mesopotamia and Egypt functioned as economic centers, storing wealth, making loans, and providing a stamp of reliability for metal transactions. When a temple guaranteed the purity and weight of silver, that guarantee carried authority. People trusted temples, with their priestly bureaucracies and divine sanction, in a way they might not trust an individual merchant. And yet, for all its advantages, the system of weighed metal had obvious inefficiencies. Every transaction required scales and weights and expertise. Disputes over purity and measurement were common. There had to be a better way, a simpler way, something that would preserve the advantages of metal money while eliminating the constant need for weighing and testing. In the rivers of Anatolia, in the kingdom of Lydia on the western edge of what is now Turkey, nature provided a curious substance. It was a mixture of gold and silver, blended naturally in the earth, and it had a pale, yellowish colour, quite distinct from pure gold. The Greeks called it electrum, and it would play a key role in one of history's most important innovations. Someone in Lydia, perhaps a merchant or a king's treasurer, conceived of a brilliant idea. What if pieces of electrum were stamped with an official mark, a symbol guaranteeing their weight and purity? Instead of weighing metal for every transaction, people could simply count out stamped pieces, trusting the mark of authority impressed upon them. The pieces could be standardized, made uniform in size and shape, so that one was exactly like another. This was the birth of coinage, and it would transform the world. But that transformation lies ahead in our story. For now, let us rest with the image of ancient traders at their scales, carefully weighing silver in the light of oil lamps, building the foundations of an economy that would eventually span the globe. On the western edge of Anatolia, where the land slopes down toward the Aegean Sea, there once lay a kingdom of extraordinary wealth. The rivers of this region carried something precious in their waters, flecks of gold and silver mingled together by the earth itself. For centuries, the people who lived here had panned these rivers, collecting the pale yellow metal that nature provided. They called it electrum, this natural alloy, and it would give rise to one of humanity's most transformative inventions. The kingdom was called Lydia, and its capital was Sardis, a city that sat at the crossroads of ancient trade routes. Merchants from Greece and Persia and the distant east passed through Sardis, exchanging goods and ideas. It was a place of commerce and innovation, and sometime around 600 years before the Common Era, someone in Lydia conceived of an idea that would change the world forever. The idea was simple, almost obvious in retrospect. Instead of weighing metal for every transaction, why not create standardized pieces of known weight and purity? And instead of relying on trust alone, why not stamp these pieces with an official mark, a guarantee from the king himself that the metal was genuine? These stamped pieces of electrum became the world's first true coins, and they emerged from Lydia like ripples spreading across still water. We don't know exactly who created the first coins. Perhaps it was a clever merchant seeking to simplify his business. Perhaps it was a royal treasurer looking for a more efficient way to pay the king's soldiers and collect the king's taxes. The ancient historian Herodotus, writing about a century and a half later, credited the Lydians with the invention, though he provided few details. What we do know comes largely from the coins themselves, thousands of which have survived to tell their silent story. The earliest Lydian coins were made of electrum, that natural blend of gold and silver. They were small, roughly the size and shape of a bean, and they bore a simple design on one side. The most common image was a lion's head, the symbol of the Lydian kings, fierce and proud. The other side typically showed just a punch mark, the impression left by the tool used to strike the coin. These early coins were crude by later standards, but they represented a revolutionary concept. For the first time, the value of a piece of metal was guaranteed not by weighing but by the authority of the state. The king who likely oversaw the first widespread production of coins was Aliats, who ruled Lydia from around 610 to 560 years before the Common Era. Under his reign, Lydian coins began to circulate more broadly, facilitating trade and filling the royal treasury. But it was his son who had become synonymous with wealth itself, his name echoing down through the millennia as a byword for riches beyond measure. Croesus became king of Lydia around 560 years before the Common Era, and he inherited a kingdom already prosperous from trade and gold. But Croesus did something his father had not. He introduced coins of pure gold and pure silver, separating the metals that nature had blended together. This was a significant innovation. Pure gold coins and pure silver coins were easier to value than electrum, whose gold content could vary unpredictably. Merchants and traders could now deal in standardized units of known purity, simplifying commerce throughout the region. The gold coins of Croesus were called staters, a word that simply meant standard or weight. They bore the image of a lion and a bull facing each other, symbols of royal power and perhaps of the union of different peoples under Lydian rule. These coins were beautiful objects, carefully struck, their designs sharp and clear. To hold a gold stater of Croesus today, in a museum or a collector's cabinet, is to touch something that changed human history. The wealth of Croesus became legendary even in his own lifetime. Greek visitors to Sardis marveled at the treasures accumulated in the Lydian palace. The phrase "rich as Croesus" entered the language and has never left. 2,500 years later, we still invoke his name when we want to describe extraordinary wealth. Few historical figures have achieved such lasting fame for their fortune. But Croesus was not merely rich. He was also generous to the gods, or at least eager to secure their favour, he sent magnificent offerings to the Greek oracle at Delphi, hoping to learn his fate. The oracle, famously ambiguous, told him that if he went to war against Persia, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus took this as encouragement and marched against the Persian king Cyrus the Great. The empire he destroyed, as it turned out, was his own. Lydia fell to Persia around 546 years before the Common Era, and Croesus passed from history into legend. Yet the invention he had refined lived on. The Persians who conquered Lydia recognized the value of coined money and continued to produce it. And more importantly, the Greeks who had traded with Lydia and marvelled at its coins began to mint their own. The technology of coinage spread westward across the Aegean Sea, taking root in the city-states of Greece and transforming their economies. The Greeks embraced coinage with remarkable enthusiasm. Within a generation or two of Lydia's fall, cities across the Greek world were striking their own coins, each with distinctive designs that proclaimed their origin. These coins became symbols of civic pride and identity, tiny ambassadors carrying the images of local gods and heroes wherever trade might take them. Among the most famous and enduring of Greek coins were the silver tetradrachms of Athens. These substantial coins, weighing about 17 grams each, bore the image of Athena, the city's patron goddess, on one side. On the reverse was her sacred bird, the owl, along with an olive branch and the first letters of the city's name. Athenian owls, as these coins came to be known, circulated throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. They became a kind of international currency, accepted far from Athens itself, because their silver content and quality were trusted everywhere. The source of Athens' silver was a range of hills to the southeast of the city, a region called Laurium. Here, thousands of workers, many of them enslaved, laboured in cramped tunnels to extract silver ore from the earth. The mines of Laurium were enormously productive, providing Athens with the wealth to build its fleet, adorn its temples, and pay its citizens. When a particularly rich vein was discovered around 483 years before the Common Era, the Athenian statesman Themistocles persuaded his fellow citizens to invest the windfall in warships rather than distributing it among themselves. Those ships would soon prove decisive in the wars against Persia. Other Greek cities developed their own distinctive coinages. The island of Aegina, one of the earliest Greek minting centres, produced coins stamped with a sea turtle, reflecting the island's maritime character. Corinth used the image of Pegasus, the winged horse of mythology. Syracuse, the great Greek city of Sicily, issued coins of exceptional beauty, their designs carved by artists whose names we still know. These Syracusan coins, featuring the head of the nymph Arethusa surrounded by dolphins, are considered among the finest examples of ancient numismatic art. The spread of coinage through the Greek world happened remarkably quickly. By 500 years before the Common Era, most major Greek cities were minting their own money. The technology had proven itself too useful to ignore. Coins made trade easier, taxes simpler to collect, and wages easier to pay. They allowed wealth to be stored compactly and transported safely, and they provided a powerful medium for political expression. This last point deserves consideration. Coins were not merely economic tools, they were statements of sovereignty and identity. When a city minted coins bearing its own symbols, it was proclaiming its independence and importance. The images on coins told stories about what each city valued, which gods it honoured, which myths it cherished. In a world without mass media, coins served as a form of portable propaganda, carrying messages wherever they travelled. The production of coins also generated profit for the issuing authority, a concept known as seigniorage. This is the difference between the face value of a coin and the cost of producing it. When a king or a city minted coins, they could claim a small portion of the value for themselves simply by declaring that the coin was worth slightly more than the metal it contained. This premium covered the costs of minting and provided revenue for the treasury. Seigniorage has remained a feature of currency systems ever since, a quiet profit that accrues to whoever controls the money supply. Some scholars have drawn connections between the spread of coinage and the development of Greek democracy. The argument is subtle and not universally accepted, but it runs something like this. Coins democratized wealth in a way that earlier forms of money had not. Before coins, significant wealth was measured in land and livestock, assets that were difficult to accumulate quickly and easy to see. With coins, a clever merchant or skilled craftsman could build up wealth without owning vast estates. This created new classes of wealthy citizens who demanded a voice in government. The connection is speculative, but it's worth considering how the physical form of money might shape the societies that use it. What we can say with more confidence is that coinage transformed the Greek economy. Trade became more fluid, more flexible, more extensive. Merchants could now travel farther and deal with strangers more easily, knowing that their coins would be recognized and accepted. Markets grew more sophisticated, prices more standardized. The use of money became not just common but universal, touching every aspect of daily life. Imagine the experience of an ordinary Greek in this new world of coins. A farmer brings his produce to the agora, the marketplace at the heart of the city. He sells his olives and grain, receiving in return small silver coins stamped with the owl of Athena. With these coins jingling in his pouch, he walks through the market, purchasing a new cloak from a weaver, a pot from a craftsman, a cup of wine from a tavern keeper. Each transaction is quick and simple. No need to negotiate the relative value of olives and cloaks. No need to find someone who wants exactly what he has to offer. The coins mediate everything, allowing strangers to exchange goods and services with a minimum of friction. This was the world that coinage created, a world of easier exchange, broader markets, and unprecedented economic complexity. The invention that began in Lydia had found its fullest expression in Greece, and from there it would spread still further. The great empire of Persia adopted coinage throughout its vast domains. The kingdoms that emerged from Alexander the Great's conquest spread Greek-style coins from Egypt to India, and in the West, a rising power on the Italian peninsula was watching carefully, preparing to take the technology of money to still greater heights. Rome was that power, and Roman coins would eventually circulate across 3 continents, binding together an empire of unprecedented scale. But Rome's monetary story would have its own complications, its own triumphs, and its own sobering lessons about the relationship between money and power. For now, let us linger in the Greek world a moment longer, imagining the gleam of silver owls passing from hand to hand in the bright Mediterranean sunlight. These small circles of metal stamped with images of gods and animals represented something profound. They were promises made visible, trust made tangible, value made portable. In the gentle clink of coins changing hands, we can hear the foundations of the modern economy being laid, one transaction at a time. While the Greeks refined the art of coinage along the shores of the Aegean, another civilization was rising to the west. On the banks of the Tiber River, in the hills of central Italy, a small city-state was growing in strength and ambition. Rome began as a modest settlement, overshadowed by its more sophisticated neighbours. But over the centuries, through persistence and pragmatism, it would expand to rule the entire Mediterranean world. And as Rome grew, so too did its need for money. The early Romans were not great innovators in matters of currency. They borrowed ideas from the peoples around them, adapting and improving as circumstances required. For centuries, the Romans relied on simple forms of exchange. Cattle served as a measure of value, just as they had for countless other peoples. The Latin word for money, pecunia, derives from pecus, meaning cattle, a linguistic echo of those pastoral origins. Land and livestock were the true wealth of early Rome, and the economy remained relatively simple. But as Rome expanded and its trade networks grew more complex, something more practical was needed. The Romans turned to bronze, that useful alloy of copper and tin, and began using lumps of it as a medium of exchange. These early pieces of bronze were called esrude, meaning rough bronze, and they were exactly that, irregular chunks of metal valued by weight rather than by any official standard. To make a purchase with esrude, you would weigh out the appropriate amount, much as traders had done for millennia in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Gradually, the Romans began to standardize their bronze money. They cast bars of bronze with official marks, indicating that the metal had been verified by the state. These were called aes signatum, meaning stamped bronze, and they represented a step toward true coinage. The bars were heavy, often weighing several pounds, and they bore images of cattle or other symbols. They were still valued primarily by weight, but the official stamps added an element of trust and convenience. The true transition to coinage came later, probably in the late 4th or early 3rd century before the Common Era. The Romans began producing round bronze coins with standardized weights and official designs. The basic unit was called the aes, a hefty coin that originally weighed about 1 Roman pound, roughly 327 grams. These early coins were cast rather than struck, poured into moulds and then finished by hand. They bore images of gods, particularly Janus, the two-faced deity who watched over beginnings and endings, doorways and transitions. The ass was useful for local transactions, but it was too heavy for large-scale trade. As Rome's commercial ambitions grew, lighter and more valuable coins became necessary. The Romans looked to their Greek neighbours and rivals for inspiration, and they began to strike silver coins in the Greek style. These early Roman silver pieces imitated Greek designs, acknowledging the cultural influence of the older civilization. The great transformation of Roman coinage came during the Second Punic War, that desperate struggle against the Carthaginian general Hannibal. In the year 211 before the Common Era, as Hannibal's army ravaged the Italian countryside, Rome introduced a new silver coin that would become the backbone of its monetary system for centuries. This coin was called the denarius, from the Latin word for 10, because it was originally valued at 10 of the older bronze coins. The denarius was a small silver coin, weighing about 4.5 grams, roughly the weight of a modern United States dime. On its face, it typically bore the helmeted head of Roma, the goddess who personified the city. On the reverse were various images, often the Dioscuri, the divine twins Castor and Pollux riding on horseback. The denarius was convenient, portable, and widely trusted. It became the standard currency not just of Rome, but of the entire Roman world. Alongside the denarius, the Romans maintained a range of other denominations to serve different needs. The sestertius was a bronze coin worth a quarter of a denarius, useful for everyday purchases. The as, though much reduced in size from its early days, continued to circulate for small transactions, and for large payments for the wealth of senators and the treasuries of kings, there was gold. The primary Roman gold coin was the aureus, a substantial piece weighing about 8 grams of pure gold. One aureus was worth 25 denarii, a considerable sum representing perhaps a month's wages for a common labourer. Gold coins circulated less freely than silver, reserved for major transactions, military pay, and the accumulation of serious wealth. But they played a crucial role in the Roman economy, providing a stable anchor for the entire monetary system. Roman coins were not merely tools of commerce. They were instruments of communication, carrying messages across the vast empire. Every coin that passed from hand to hand bore images chosen by the authorities in Rome. In the early Republic, these images were relatively restrained, depicting gods and mythological scenes. But as individual leaders grew more powerful, they began to place their own images and propaganda on the coinage. Julius Caesar was the first living Roman to place his own portrait on coins, a bold statement of personal power that broke with republican traditions. The coins issued in his name showed his distinctive profile, lean and determined, crowned with a laurel wreath. This was more than vanity. It was claim to authority that everyone who used money would see and remember. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 before the Common Era, his coins continued to circulate, his face gazing out from purses and treasure chests across the Roman world. The tradition of imperial portraits continued and expanded under the emperors who followed. Augustus, the first true Roman emperor, standardized the coinage system and established a major mint at Lugdunum, modern Lyon in France. Coins bearing his image proclaimed his authority from Britain to Syria. Each subsequent emperor followed suit, and today we know what many Roman emperors looked like primarily through their coinage. These small metal portraits are windows into the ancient world, preserving faces that might otherwise have been lost to time. The Roman monetary system at its best was remarkably sophisticated. A network of mints across the empire produced coins to consistent standards. Soldiers were paid regularly in good silver denarii, which they spent in the local economies wherever they were stationed. Merchants could travel from one end of the Mediterranean to the other, confident that Roman coins would be accepted everywhere. This monetary unity helped bind together an empire of astonishing diversity, creating a common economic language that transcended barriers of culture and tongue. But maintaining such a system required discipline, and discipline, over time, proved difficult to sustain. The temptation to stretch the money supply to pay for wars and public works by producing more coins from the same amount of metal was ever present. And gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, Roman emperors began to succumb to that temptation. The process is called debasement, and it works like this. Instead of minting coins from pure silver, the mint mixes in cheaper metals, copper or bronze, while maintaining the same face value. A denarius that once contained 4.5 grams of pure silver might now contain only 4 grams, or 3, or two, with the difference made up by base metal. To the casual eye, the coins look similar enough, but their real value, the value of the metal they contain, has declined. Nero, the emperor remembered for his extravagance and cruelty, was among the first to significantly debase the silver coinage. Around the year 64 of the Common Era, the same year as the Great Fire of Rome, Nero reduced the silver content of the denarius by about 15%. The change was subtle, and the economy absorbed it without immediate crisis. But a precedent had been set, and future emperors would remember it. Through the 2nd century, debasement continued gradually. Each emperor faced expenses, wars on distant frontiers, public buildings in Rome, gifts to keep the army loyal, and each emperor found it convenient to stretch the coinage a little further. The silver content of the denarius declined decade by decade, a slow erosion that accumulated over generations. The real crisis came in the 3rd century, that troubled era when the Roman Empire nearly collapsed under the weight of civil wars, foreign invasions, and economic chaos. Between the years 235 and 284, more than 50 men claimed the title of emperor, most of them rising and falling through violence. Armies needed to be paid, walls needed to be built, and the treasury was perpetually empty. The response was predictable and disastrous. The silver content of the denarius plummeted. By the middle of the 3rd century, coins that nominally bore the same name and value as the denarii of earlier generations contained barely 5% silver. They were bronze coins with a thin silver wash, the metallic equivalent of a hollow promise. Prices rose as merchants recognized that the coins in their hands were worth far less than their face value suggested. Inflation, that quiet thief, stalked through the Roman economy. The consequences rippled through every aspect of life. Soldiers demanded payment in goods rather than worthless coins. Tax collectors insisted on payment in kind, in grain and livestock, because currency had become unreliable. Long-distance trade declined as merchants lost faith in money's ability to store value. The sophisticated commercial economy that had united the Mediterranean began to fragment, retreating towards simpler, more local patterns of exchange. Emperor Diocletian, who came to power in 284, attempted sweeping reforms to stabilize the economy. He introduced new coins, reorganized the tax system, and in 301 issued a famous edict attempting to fix maximum prices for goods and services throughout the empire. The edict on maximum prices was extraordinarily detailed, listing hundreds of items from wheat to wool to haircuts, each with a legally mandated ceiling. The penalty for exceeding these prices was death. But prices cannot be controlled by decree when the underlying currency is unstable. Merchants simply withdrew from the market rather than sell at a loss. The black market flourished. Diocletian's edict, despite its draconian penalties, failed to restore economic order. The fundamental problem remained. The currency had lost the trust of the people who used it. A more lasting solution came from Emperor Constantine, who rose to power in the early 4th century. Constantine introduced a new gold coin called the solidus, weighing about 4.5 grams of pure gold. Unlike the debased silver coins that had plagued the 3rd century, the solidus maintained its purity and weight with remarkable consistency. It became the anchor of a reformed monetary system, a reliable store of value that merchants and officials could trust. The solidus would prove extraordinarily durable. It remained the standard gold coin of the Roman and later Byzantine Empire for more than 700 years, maintaining its integrity across centuries of political upheaval. Even after the Western Roman Empire fell, the solidus continued to circulate in the Eastern Mediterranean, a testament to the power of sound money. The very word soldier may derive from solidus, reflecting the coin in which Roman troops were paid. The story of Roman money offers lessons that echo through the ages. A stable currency can unite a vast and diverse empire, facilitating trade and binding distant peoples together. But currency requires trust, and trust, once lost, is difficult to regain. The temptation to debase the coinage, to pay today's bills by undermining tomorrow's money, proved irresistible to emperors facing immediate crises. The long-term consequences of that choice, inflation, economic fragmentation, the decline of commerce, took generations to unfold but were severe when they arrived. As the Western Roman Empire faded in the 5th century, overrun by peoples from beyond its borders, the sophisticated monetary economy that had characterized Roman civilization faded with it. In many parts of Western Europe, coins became scarce, and people returned to older patterns of exchange, barter and gift-giving and payment in kind. The great wheel of economic history seemed to turn backward towards simpler times. But the idea of money, the technology of coinage, did not disappear entirely. It survived in the Byzantine East, where Constantinople preserved Roman traditions for another 1,000 years, and it would be rediscovered and reinvented in the medieval West, as new kingdoms arose from the ruins of empire. The story of money was far from over. It was merely pausing, gathering strength for its next transformation. The great empires of antiquity eventually faded, as all empires do. Rome fell not in a single catastrophic moment, but gradually, like a tide withdrawing from the shore. By the late 5th century of the Common Era, the western half of the Roman Empire had fragmented into a patchwork of successor kingdoms, ruled by peoples from beyond the old frontiers. The sophisticated monetary economy that had united the Mediterranean world began to unravel, and in many places coins became scarce. In the countryside of what had been Roman Gaul or Britain or Spain, the daily rhythms of life continued much as they always had. Farmers tended their fields, craftsmen plied their trades, and communities found ways to manage without the steady flow of imperial currency. Payment in kind became common again, wages settled in grain or livestock rather than silver. Local lords collected rents and taxes in whatever form their peasants could provide. The great commercial networks that had carried goods and coins across thousands of miles contracted, pulling back towards simpler, more local patterns of exchange. This was not a complete reversion to the economies of prehistoric times. Coins still circulated, though in diminished quantities. The memory of Roman monetary sophistication survived, and people continued to value precious metals. But the elaborate system of mints and standardized denominations that had characterized the empire largely disappeared in the West. What remained was fragmentary, inconsistent, a shadow of what had been. Yet even as the western provinces declined, the eastern half of the Roman Empire endured. Constantinople, the city that Emperor Constantine had founded on the shores of the Bosphorus, remained a beacon of civilization, its walls unbreached, its treasury full. The Byzantine Empire, as historians would later call it, preserved Roman traditions for another 1,000 years, and at the heart of Byzantine commerce was the coin that Constantine himself had introduced, the golden solidus. The solidus remained remarkably stable throughout the Byzantine centuries. Its weight and purity were carefully maintained, making it a trusted currency throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Merchants from distant lands accepted Byzantine gold with confidence, knowing that the empire stood behind its money. The solidus became an international currency, the dollar or euro of its age, facilitating trade wherever it travelled. But Byzantium was not the only power rising in the early medieval world. In the 7th century of the Common Era, a new civilization emerged from the Arabian Peninsula with astonishing speed and transformative power. Within a century of the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632, his followers had conquered an empire stretching from Spain to Central Asia. This was the Islamic Caliphate, and it would reshape the monetary landscape of half the world. The early Arab conquerors initially used the coins they found in the lands they overran, Byzantine gold in the west and Persian silver in the east. But as the Caliphate consolidated its power, its rulers recognized the need for a distinctive Islamic coinage. In 696 and 697, the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik introduced new coins that would define Islamic monetary tradition for centuries to come. The gold coin was called the dinar, a name derived from the Roman denarius, though it was worth far more than that ancient silver coin. The Islamic dinar was modelled on the Byzantine solidus, similar in weight and purity. But its appearance was strikingly different. Where Byzantine coins bore the image of emperors and Christian symbols, Islamic coins were purely textual. Quranic verses and declarations of faith adorned both sides, proclaiming the unity of God and the mission of his prophet. This was money as a religious statement, every coin a tiny sermon circulating through the marketplace. Alongside the gold dinar, Abd al-Malik introduced the silver dirham, based on the Persian silver coins that had circulated in the eastern provinces. The dirham became the workhorse of Islamic commerce, used for everyday transactions, while the dinar served for larger payments and the accumulation of wealth. Together, these two denominations formed a bimetallic system that would endure for centuries. The Islamic monetary system was remarkably sophisticated. Mints operated across the caliphate, producing coins to consistent standards. The religious inscriptions on the coins ensured a degree of uniformity, since any deviation would be immediately obvious and potentially sacrilegious. Merchants travelling from Spain to India could carry Islamic coins with confidence, knowing they would be recognized and accepted throughout the vast Islamic world. The Caliphate sat astride the great trade routes connecting Europe, Africa, and Asia. Arab merchants sailed the Indian Ocean, traded across the Sahara Desert, and exchanged goods with Byzantine and European partners in Mediterranean ports. The dinar and dirham travelled with them, becoming international currencies that facilitated commerce across an enormous geographical expanse. Gold flowed from West African mines through trans-Saharan caravans to the mints of North Africa and the Middle East. Silver came from Central Asia and later from European sources. The Islamic world became the hub of a truly global trading network. While the Islamic Caliphate flourished in the east and south, Western Europe was slowly rebuilding. The Germanic kingdoms that had replaced Roman authority gradually stabilized, developing their own political and economic institutions. Coins continued to circulate, though in reduced quantities and often of inferior quality. The memory of Roman monetary sophistication lingered, a standard to aspire to even if it could not be matched. The revival of European coinage gained momentum under an unlikely figure, a Frankish king whose vision would reshape the continent. Charlemagne, Charles the Great, ruled the Frankish kingdom from 768 until his death in 814. Through conquest and diplomacy, he united much of Western Europe under his rule, creating an empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to central Italy. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned him Emperor of the Romans, reviving a title that had lapsed in the West for more than 3 centuries. Among Charlemagne's many reforms was a comprehensive reorganization of the monetary system. Around 790, he introduced a new system based on the silver penny, known in Latin as the denarius, and in the emerging vernacular languages as the denier or pfennig or penny. This was a small, thin silver coin, much lighter than the old Roman denarius but carefully standardized in weight and purity. Charlemagne's monetary reform established relationships between denominations that would persist for centuries in European accounting. 12 pennies equaled 1 shilling, and 20 shillings equaled 1 pound. This gave the famous ratio of 240 pennies to the pound, a system that survived in British currency until 1971. The shilling and the pound were initially just accounting units, ways of expressing larger sums. Only the penny actually existed as a physical coin, but the system provided a framework for commerce and record-keeping that served Europe well through the medieval centuries. The English pound sterling traces its origins to this Carolingian system. The word sterling probably derives from an Old English word for a small star, referring to a mark that appeared on early English pennies. A pound sterling was literally a pound weight of silver pennies, 240 coins of standardized weight and purity. Over time, pound sterling became simply a name for the English monetary unit, even after the actual coins no longer weighed a full pound of silver. Charlemagne's monetary system spread across his empire and beyond, adopted by kingdoms and principalities throughout Western Europe. The silver penny became the standard European coin, circulating in local variants from England to Poland, from Scandinavia to Sicily. For several centuries, these small silver coins were virtually the only money in common use. Trade slowly revived, towns grew, and the European economy began its long recovery from the disruptions of the post-Roman centuries. But by the 12th and 13th centuries, the silver penny was no longer sufficient for the expanding needs of European commerce. Trade was growing, especially in the Mediterranean, where Italian merchants were becoming increasingly prominent. Larger transactions required larger coins, something more substantial than a pocketful of tiny pennies. The Italian city-states led the way in monetary innovation. These small but wealthy republics, Venice and Genoa and Florence chief among them, sat at the crossroads of Mediterranean trade. Their merchants dealt with Byzantine gold and Islamic dinars, and they understood the value of reliable high-denomination currency. In 1252, the city of Florence introduced a new gold coin that would transform European finance. The coin was called the florin, named after the city that minted it. On one side it bore the fleur de lis, the lily that was Florence's symbol. On the other was the image of St. John the Baptist, the city's patron. The florin contained about 3.5 grams of pure gold, carefully maintained to a consistent standard. It was beautiful, reliable and universally trusted, the Florentine florin quickly became the preferred currency for international trade. Merchants from England to Egypt accepted florins with confidence, knowing exactly what they were getting. The coin's consistency was almost obsessive. For more than 3 centuries, the florin maintained its original weight and purity, an extraordinary achievement in an age when debasement was a constant temptation. This reliability was Florence's gift to European commerce and the foundation of the city's immense banking wealth. Not to be outdone, Venice introduced its own gold coin in 1284. This was the ducat, named after the Duchy of Venice. The ducat was slightly heavier than the florin, containing about 3.5 grams of gold. On its face was the image of the Doge of Venice kneeling before St. Mark, receiving a banner of authority. The ducat became another pillar of international trade, competing with the florin for prestige and acceptance. These gold coins circulated far beyond the cities that minted them. Florins and ducats travelled along trade routes to northern Europe, to the Levant, to the Black Sea ports where Venetian and Genoese merchants traded for goods from Asia. They represented a monetary standard that transcended political boundaries, a common language of value that facilitated commerce across the fragmented patchwork of medieval Europe. The Italian city-states were not just minting coins, they were also inventing modern banking. The word bank itself comes from the Italian banca, the bench or table where money changers conducted their business in medieval marketplaces. These money changers evaluated foreign coins, exchanged currencies, and gradually expanded into more sophisticated financial services. The great Italian banking families became legendary for their wealth and influence. The Bardi and Peruzzi of Florence were among the largest bankers in 14th century Europe, financing kings and popes, trading in wool and grain, maintaining networks of agents across the continent. When King Edward III of England defaulted on his massive debts in the 1340s, both houses collapsed, victims of their own overextension. But others rose to take their place. The most famous of all banking dynasties was the Medici family of Florence. From modest beginnings in the 14th century, the Medici built a banking empire that dominated European finance for generations. They pioneered new techniques of accounting and credit, maintaining branches across Europe staffed by trusted agents. Medici wealth financed the Renaissance, supporting artists and scholars whose works still inspire us today. And Medici political influence eventually made them Grand Dukes of Tuscany and provided 2 queens to France. One of the most important innovations of medieval banking was the bill of exchange. This was essentially a written instruction to pay a specific sum to a specific person at a specific time and place. A merchant in Florence could give money to a banker and receive a bill payable in London. He could then travel to London without carrying heavy, risky bags of gold, present his bill, and collect payment from the London branch of the banking network. The bill of exchange made long-distance trade safer and more convenient, separating the physical transfer of money from the transfer of value. There was a complication, however. The Christian Church prohibited usury, the lending of money at interest. This created difficulties for bankers whose business fundamentally depended on profiting from the use of other people's money. Medieval financiers developed creative workarounds. Exchange rates between currencies might be set to include a hidden profit. Penalties for late payment might function as disguised interest. The line between legitimate profit and forbidden usury was constantly debated and never entirely clear. Despite these complications, medieval banking flourished, credit expanded, trade grew, and the European economy became increasingly sophisticated. The groundwork was being laid for the even greater transformations that lay ahead: the age of exploration, the rise of nation-states, and eventually the modern global economy. But those developments would require another monetary revolution, one that would make metal coins themselves seem almost old-fashioned. The age of paper money was approaching. While European merchants were perfecting their gold florins and ducats, while Italian bankers were building their networks of credit and exchange, something remarkable had already happened on the other side of the world. In China, centuries before the first European would conceive of such a thing, paper had become money. It is one of history's great innovations, hiding in plain sight, waiting to be rediscovered by the West. The Chinese had invented paper itself, probably around the 1st century of the Common Era, though the technology was refined over the following centuries. They used it for writing, for art, for wrapping, and eventually for printing. The earliest printed books in the world came from China, created using carved wooden blocks pressed onto sheets of paper. It was perhaps inevitable that this versatile material would eventually find its way into the realm of money. The story begins during the Tang Dynasty, that golden age of Chinese civilization that lasted from 618 to 907 of the Common Era. The Tang capital of Chang'an was one of the greatest cities in the world, a cosmopolitan metropolis where merchants from across Asia came to trade. Business was booming, and that created a problem. The strings of bronze coins that served as everyday money in China were heavy and cumbersome. A major transaction might require carrying thousands of coins, literally weighing down the merchants who dealt in large sums. The solution emerged gradually from the practices of commerce itself. Merchants began depositing their heavy coins with trusted agents in the capital, receiving in return a certificate acknowledging the deposit. These certificates could then be carried to distant provinces, where they could be redeemed for coins from another agent in the network. The certificate was lighter than a feather compared to the coins it represented. Merchants called these documents fakian, meaning flying money, because value could now travel so swiftly across the vast distances of the Chinese Empire. Flying money was not yet true paper currency. It was more like a check or a letter of credit, promise of payment backed by actual coins held in reserve. But it established an important principle. A piece of paper could represent value. It could stand in for metal coins, facilitating trade without the burden of carrying heavy bags of bronze. The Chinese had taken the first step toward a revolutionary idea. The transformation from certificates of deposit to true paper money happened during the Song Dynasty, which ruled China from 960 to 1279. The Song era was a time of remarkable economic growth and technological innovation. Population boomed, cities expanded, and trade flourished both domestically and internationally. The demand for money grew faster than the supply of coins could keep pace. The problem was particularly acute in the southwestern province of Sichuan. This region had limited access to copper, the metal used for Chinese coins, and had been using iron coins instead. Iron coins were even heavier and less valuable than their bronze counterparts. Conducting business with iron currency was almost absurdly cumbersome. Something had to give. Around 1024, in the early years of the Song Dynasty, the government of Sichuan took a fateful step. it began issuing paper notes called jiaozi, officially backed by the government and accepted for payment of taxes. These were not merely private certificates of deposit, they were government-issued currency, printed on mulberry bark paper, bearing official seals and serial numbers, and designed to circulate as money alongside metal coins. The jiaozi was the world's first true paper money, predating anything similar in Europe by nearly 700 years. The notes were initially issued in specific denominations and could be exchanged for coins at designated offices. The government limited the quantity printed and set expiration dates, after which old notes had to be exchanged for new ones. These precautions helped maintain the value of the currency and build public confidence in the strange new medium. The experiment was remarkably successful. Paper money spread from Sichuan to other parts of China, issued under different names but following similar principles. The Song government found paper currency enormously useful for paying soldiers, funding public works, and managing the complex finances of a vast empire. Printing money was easier and cheaper than minting coins, and the notes were far more convenient for large transactions. But paper money carried risks that metal coins did not. The temptation to print more notes, to pay for government expenses without the discipline of a limited metal supply, proved difficult to resist. Over time, successive governments issued more and more paper currency, and the value of each note gradually declined. Inflation crept into the Song economy, a preview of troubles that would grow more severe in later centuries. The Mongol conquest of China brought new rulers but continued the use of paper money. Kublai Khan, grandson of the great conqueror Genghis Khan, established the Yuan dynasty in 1271. His empire stretched from China to Persia, the largest contiguous land empire in history. And throughout this vast domain, Kublai Khan promoted the use of paper currency with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. The yuan paper money was called chow, and it was backed by silver reserves held by the government. In theory, anyone could exchange their paper notes for silver at official offices. In practice, the government discouraged such exchanges, preferring that the paper circulate indefinitely. Kublai Khan made acceptance of paper money mandatory throughout his realm. Refusing to accept chow was a crime, punishable by severe penalties. Metal coins were largely withdrawn from circulation, leaving paper as the dominant medium of exchange. To European visitors, this was almost beyond belief. The most famous of these visitors was Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who spent years at Kublai Khan's court in the late 13th century. When Marco Polo returned to Europe and described what he had seen, his accounts were met with skepticism, but his description of Chinese paper money is worth savouring, a glimpse of genuine wonder at something that seemed almost magical. Marco Polo described how the great Khan took the bark of mulberry trees, the same trees whose leaves fed the silkworms, and had it processed into something like paper. This paper was cut into rectangles of various sizes, marked with official seals, and issued with the solemnity of pure gold or silver, and everyone throughout the empire, under pain of death, was required to accept these pieces of paper as payment for goods of any kind. To Marco Polo, who came from a world where money meant heavy metal coins, this was a kind of alchemy. The Khan had found a way to create wealth from the bark of trees, but the magic had limits. The Yuan dynasty, like the Song before it, eventually succumbed to the temptation of excessive printing. Military campaigns and court expenses demanded more money than the treasury held, and the printing presses provided an easy solution. The quantity of paper money in circulation grew, and its value fell. By the time the Yuan dynasty collapsed in 1368, driven out by rebellion and replaced by the Ming, paper money had lost nearly all its purchasing power. The early Ming emperors tried to restore confidence in paper currency, but the damage had been done. People had learned to distrust paper that could be created at will by the government. They hoarded silver and avoided paper notes whenever possible. By the middle of the 15th century, the Ming government essentially abandoned paper money, returning to a metallic standard based primarily on silver. China would not successfully issue paper currency again for centuries. The failure of Ming paper money is a cautionary tale, but it should not obscure the remarkable achievement it represents. For several centuries, China operated the most sophisticated monetary system in the world, using technology that Europe would not develop for another 600 or 700 years. The problems that eventually destroyed Chinese paper money, overissue and inflation, were not unique to paper. They were the same problems that had plagued Roman silver and would later afflict paper currencies around the world. The Chinese experience with paper money was a pioneering experiment, flawed but fundamentally sound in concept. The idea of paper money travelled slowly westward along the trade routes that connected Asia and Europe. Travellers like Marco Polo brought back descriptions, but descriptions alone were not enough to spark imitation. Europe remained committed to its gold and silver coins, its established networks of metal-based commerce. Paper money would have to be reinvented independently, growing out of European financial practices. The reinvention began in an unlikely place, the workshops of English goldsmiths in the 17th century. Goldsmiths had long served as informal bankers, storing valuables for customers who lacked secure places to keep them. When you deposited gold with a goldsmith, you received a receipt, a written promise to return your gold on demand. These receipts were initially personal documents specifying that the gold would be returned to the named depositor. But over time, goldsmiths began issuing receipts that were payable to the bearer, whoever held the paper. Such receipts could be transferred from person to person, used to settle debts without anyone actually withdrawing the underlying gold. If you owed me money, you could give me a goldsmith's receipt, and I could either redeem it for gold or pass it along to someone else. The receipts had become a form of paper money circulating alongside coins in the English economy. The goldsmiths made another crucial discovery. Not everyone who deposited gold came back to claim it at the same time. The gold sat in their vaults, earning nothing, while customers went about their business with paper receipts. Why not lend out some of that gold, earning interest, while keeping enough in reserve to satisfy the customers who did want their deposits back? This was the birth of fractional reserve banking, the practice of lending out more money than you actually hold in reserve. Fractional reserve banking could be immensely profitable, but it also carried risks. If too many depositors demanded their gold at once, the goldsmith might not have enough to satisfy them. Such a run could destroy a bank overnight. The system depended on confidence, on the belief that the gold would be there when needed. When confidence wavered, crisis followed. In 1694, a more formal institution emerged that would shape the future of paper money. The Bank of England was founded that year, created primarily to raise money for King William III's war against France. Wealthy investors pooled their resources to lend to the government, and in exchange they received the right to issue banknotes, paper promises to pay that would circulate as money. The Bank of England was not the world's first central bank, but it would become the most influential, its practices copied by nations around the globe. Bank of England notes were backed by the bank's reserves of gold and silver, and by the creditworthiness of the English government. They were not legal tender at first, meaning that no one was required to accept them, but they were convenient and trustworthy, and they gradually became a normal part of English commerce. The age of paper money had begun in Europe. Not all experiments in paper currency ended so happily. In France, an ambitious Scottish financier named John Law convinced the French government to let him revolutionize its finances. Between 1716 and 1720, Law created a complex scheme involving a central bank, paper money, and a company that held trading rights to France's Louisiana territory. The Mississippi Company, as it was known, promised fabulous returns from the supposedly limitless wealth of the American interior. Speculation drove the company's shares to absurd heights. Fortunes were made on paper as the price climbed ever higher. But the wealth was illusory, built on nothing but hope and the printing of more paper money. When confidence finally cracked, the scheme collapsed with devastating speed. Share prices plummeted, the currency became nearly worthless, and France was left with a generation-long distrust of paper money and central banking. The French would try again later, during the revolution that began in 1789. The revolutionary government issued paper currency called assignats, initially backed by confiscated church lands. Once again, the temptation to print more proved irresistible. By 1796, the assignat had lost nearly all their value, destroyed by hyperinflation. France returned to metal currency, chastened by another failed experiment. These failures did not discredit paper money entirely. They revealed its dangers, the ease with which it could be overissued, the importance of maintaining public confidence. But they also demonstrated its power, its convenience, its ability to mobilize resources and facilitate commerce. Paper money was not going away. It simply needed to be managed more carefully, constrained by rules and institutions that would prevent the mistakes of the past. The foundations for such management were being laid even as experiments failed and fortunes were lost. The idea of fiat money, currency that has value because the government declares it so, was gradually becoming thinkable. And the institutions that would make fiat money workable, central banks and regulated financial systems, were slowly taking shape. The modern monetary world was coming into being, built on lessons learned through centuries of trial and error. The experiments and failures of paper money, the collapses and recoveries, were not merely setbacks. They were lessons, slowly absorbed by the nations and institutions that would shape the modern world. By the 19th century, the pieces were falling into place for a new kind of monetary order, one that would combine the convenience of paper with the stability of precious metal, creating a system that would unite the global economy as never before. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, had proven that a central bank could successfully manage a paper currency. Its notes circulated widely, trusted by merchants and ordinary citizens alike. Other nations watched and learned. Central banks began to appear across Europe, each adapting the English model to local circumstances. The Swedish Riksbank, actually founded even earlier than the Bank of England, refined its practices. The Bank of France emerged from the ashes of John Law's disaster, more cautious but eventually effective. a new institutional framework for money was taking shape. Across the Atlantic, a young nation was building its own monetary system from scratch. The United States of America, having won independence from Britain, faced the practical challenge of creating a currency that would serve a vast and growing country. The Constitution gave Congress the power to coin money and regulate its value, but the details had to be worked out through legislation and experiment. In 1792, Congress passed the Coinage Act, establishing the United States dollar as the nation's official currency. The dollar was defined in terms of both gold and silver, a bimetallic standard that attempted to use both precious metals as the foundation of the monetary system. The Act specified that $1 would equal 371 1/4 grains of pure silver or 24 3/4 grains of pure gold. This set a ratio of roughly 15 to 1 between silver and gold, reflecting the market prices of the time. The choice of the dollar as the monetary unit was influenced by the widespread circulation of Spanish dollars in the American colonies. These silver coins, also known as pieces of 8 because they could be cut into 8 bits for smaller transactions, were familiar and trusted. The new American dollar was designed to be roughly equivalent, easing the transition to a national currency. The decimal system adopted for American money, with 100 cents to the dollar, was a deliberate departure from the cumbersome British system of pounds, shillings, and pence. The bimetallic standard created complications that would persist for decades. The official ratio between gold and silver rarely matched market prices, leading one metal or the other to be undervalued at the mint. When gold was undervalued, people hoarded gold coins or melted them down, leaving mostly silver in circulation. When silver was undervalued, the reverse happened. This was Gresham's law in action, the principle that bad money drives out good. People spend the money they value less and save the money they value more. By the middle of the 19th century, the world was moving toward a simpler system. Gold, increasingly abundant thanks to discoveries in California and Australia, was emerging as the dominant monetary metal. Britain had effectively been on a gold standard since early in the century, its pounds sterling defined as a fixed quantity of gold. As Britain became the world's dominant economic power, its monetary practices gained influence. Other nations, seeking the stability and credibility that came with gold-backed currency, began to follow suit. The classical gold standard, as economists would later call it, emerged gradually in the decades after 1870. Germany adopted gold after its unification and victory in the Franco-Prussian War. France and the other members of the Latin Monetary Union followed. The United States moved definitively to gold with the Gold Standard Act of 1900. By the early 20th century, most major economies were linked through gold, their currencies defined as specific weights of the precious metal and freely convertible at fixed rates. The gold standard created a remarkable degree of international monetary stability. Exchange rates between currencies were essentially fixed, since each currency was tied to gold. A British pound was worth a certain amount of gold, and an American dollar was worth a certain amount of gold, so the exchange rate between pounds and dollars was determined by the ratio of their gold contents. This predictability facilitated international trade and investment, allowing capital to flow across borders with confidence. The pound sterling stood at the centre of this system. Britain was the workshop of the world, the hub of global trade, the financial capital where fortunes were made and deals were struck, The pound was the currency in which international contracts were written, commodities were priced, and debts were settled. London's banks and insurance companies served clients across the globe. When people spoke of sound money, they meant money backed by gold and managed with British discipline. The everyday experience of money in this era was a blend of paper and metal. Gold coins circulated for larger transactions, their weight and purity guaranteed by the issuing government. Silver coins and copper pennies served for smaller purchases, and increasingly paper banknotes provided convenience for those who preferred not to carry heavy metal. A merchant in London or New York might keep gold sovereigns or double eagles in his safe, use banknotes for daily business, and carry silver and copper for incidental expenses. Banks had become essential institutions, holding deposits, making loans, and transferring funds across distances. The checking account, which allowed depositors to make payments by written instruction rather than withdrawing cash, grew increasingly common. Money was becoming more abstract, a number in a ledger as much as a physical object in a pocket. But the international gold standard, for all its stability, had a significant weakness. It constrained the ability of governments to respond to economic crises. When times were hard and the economy needed stimulus, a country on the gold standard couldn't simply print more money. The currency had to be backed by gold, and gold was limited. This discipline was considered a virtue by many, preventing the inflationary disasters that had plagued earlier paper currencies. But it also meant that downturns could be severe and prolonged. The United States experienced this tension acutely. Financial panic struck repeatedly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, causing banks to fail and credit to freeze. The country had no central bank to serve as a lender of last resort, no institution that could provide liquidity when the system seized up. The Panic of 1907 was particularly severe, requiring intervention by the financier J.P. Morgan to prevent complete collapse. In response, Congress created the Federal Reserve System in 1913. This new central bank, modelled partly on the Bank of England, but adapted to American federalism, was designed to provide stability to the banking system. It could issue currency, hold reserves, and lend to banks in times of stress. The creation of the Federal Reserve marked a new chapter in American monetary history, though its full implications would take decades to unfold. The following year, 1914, brought a cataclysm that would shatter the old monetary order. The outbreak of World War I forced the belligerent nations to suspend gold convertibility. They needed to print money to finance the war, more money than their gold reserves could support. The classical gold standard, that elegant system of fixed exchange rates and free capital flows, collapsed almost overnight. The war lasted 4 terrible years, consuming millions of lives and mountains of wealth. When it finally ended, the world tried to restore what had been lost. Countries returned to gold in the 1920s, attempting to recreate the stability of the pre-war era. But the system was never quite the same. Exchange rates were unstable, debts were crushing, and the global economy remained fragile. The Great Depression that began in 1929 delivered the final blow. As banks failed and economies contracted, countries abandoned gold one by one, seeking the freedom to pursue recovery through monetary expansion. Britain left gold in 1931. The United States followed in 1933. The classical gold standard was gone, never to return in its original form. The Second World War brought even greater devastation than the First, but also a determination to build a better post-war order. In 1944, as the war still raged, representatives of 44 nations gathered at a resort hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new international monetary system. The agreement they reached would shape global finance for a generation. The Bretton Woods system was a compromise between the discipline of gold and the flexibility that modern economies seem to require. The United States dollar would be convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Other currencies would be pegged to the dollar at fixed exchange rates. Countries would maintain these pegs through intervention in currency markets, buying or selling their own currencies as needed. The system provided stability while allowing some room for adjustment. The dollar became the world's reserve currency, the foundation on which the post-war monetary order was built. Countries held dollars in their reserves, priced commodities in dollars, and settled international transactions in dollars. The United States, with its vast gold reserves and dominant economy, stood at the center of the system. It was a position of immense privilege, but also of responsibility. For 25 years, the Bretton Woods system worked reasonably well. The global economy grew rapidly, trade expanded, and the devastation of war gave way to prosperity. But strains accumulated beneath the surface. American spending on social programs and the Vietnam War pumped dollars into the world economy. Other countries, particularly France, grew concerned that America was exploiting its privileged position, printing money that others had to accept. By the late 1960s, the system was under severe pressure. Foreign governments held more dollars than the United States had gold to redeem them. A run on American gold seemed possible, even likely. Something had to change. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at the official rate. This event, known as the Nixon Shock, effectively ended the Bretton Woods system and severed the last link between money and precious metal. The dollar would float, its value determined by supply and demand in foreign exchange markets. Other currencies would float too, their exchange rates fluctuating daily. We had entered the era of fiat money, currency that has value because the government declares it so, backed not by gold or silver, but by confidence in the issuing authority. It was a system that earlier generations would have viewed with deep suspicion, remembering the disasters that had befallen unbacked paper currencies in the past. Yet the world adapted. Central banks learned to manage fiat currencies with reasonable stability. Inflation, though sometimes a problem, did not spiral out of control in most developed economies. The predicted catastrophe did not arrive. Today, the money in your pocket or your bank account is fiat currency, descended from those ancient experiments in paper money, but evolved far beyond them. It flows electronically around the globe, moving from account to account at the speed of light. Physical cash is becoming less common, replaced by cards and phones and digital transfers. Money has become almost entirely abstract, numbers on screens representing value that exists only because we all agree that it does. And yet, beneath all this abstraction, the fundamental nature of money remains what it has always been. It is a store of value, a medium of exchange, a unit of account. It is a tool for facilitating cooperation among strangers, a technology for extending trust across time and space. The cowrie shells and bronze coins and paper notes of earlier ages served these same functions. We have simply found new ways to do what humans have done for thousands of years. And so we come to rest at the end of our journey, having travelled from the first gifts exchanged between neighbours to the quiet hum of the modern world. We have seen shells gathered from distant shores and cattle grazing in ancient fields. We have watched coins take shape beneath the hands of craftsmen and paper transform from bark into promise. Through it all, one thread has remained constant, the simple human desire to connect, to exchange, to trust one another across the boundaries of time and distance. The money that passes through your hands tomorrow carries within it the memory of all these centuries. Every transaction, however small, echoes the ingenuity of countless generations who came before. You are part of this story, this long, gentle river of exchange that has flowed through human history since the very beginning. Now let that river carry you softly toward sleep. Let the weight of coins and the whisper of paper fade into stillness. The markets have closed, the ledgers are balanced, and there is nothing left to count or measure. Only rest remains. So breathe slowly, let your thoughts grow quiet, and drift now into the peaceful dark, knowing that the story continues gently while you sleep.